a bra that doubles as a loaded gun, a fictional sport so convincing that promoters tried to turn it into a real league, and a $300,000 movie that made nearly $14 million with a race that awarded points for running over pedestrians. Today, we're looking at 9 sci-fi movies about deadly sports. Long before dystopian teenagers started shooting each other for sponsors, the 10th victim had already established one of the earliest blueprints for the televised death game genre. The film imagines a 21st century where legalized killing has a name: the Big Hunt. Contestants take turns as hunter and victim. Win 10 rounds and you walk away with a fortune. Lose, and the game ends the obvious way. Ursula Andress plays Caroline Meredith, a woman 1 kill away from completing her 10th round. Marcello Mastroianni plays Marcello Paletti, her final target, though he has no idea who his hunter is. Caroline has already sold the outcome of her hunt to a sponsor called Ming Tea, and the ad crew is standing by to film the kill live. Marcello begins to suspect that Caroline is his hunter, so he makes his own deal with a rival television company and plans to have her killed on camera first. They circle each other through Rome, half assassins, half actors, until neither can tell anymore whether they are hunting or falling in love. Elio Petri directs. 5 years before his investigation of A Citizen Above Suspicion won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. Here his instincts run towards satire rather than suspense. Ads for the hunt promise relief for the suicidal. Slogans ask why bother with birth control when you can have death control instead. The sets are blindingly white. The fashion is aggressively 1960s, and one wall-mounted television screen's nothing but a blinking eye. It is a future built entirely out of pop art irony. The film's most famous prop earns its reputation honestly. Andress's bra doubles as a loaded weapon, aimed and fired directly at the camera. It makes for a pretty memorable sight. In 1969, Peter Watkins made the Gladiators. In this future, nations no longer send full armies into battle. Instead, they select individual soldiers to fight in something called the Peace Game, staged like a live broadcast and watched by generals from the comfort of a chateau. The 256th Peace Game takes place in Sweden. The soldiers are divided into Allied and Communist teams. The Allied side is ordered to capture a control room while under heavy fire. Meanwhile, a French activist has infiltrated the game and is trying to reach the control room, hoping to bring the entire system down from within. This is not Watkins's best film, and it has remained relatively obscure. The political satire can be a little blunt, and parts of it have not aged especially well. But the atmosphere is interesting, and The Gladiators is still worth tracking down. No list like this could skip Rollerball. You probably already know the basic story. In a future controlled by corporations, war has been eliminated, and Rollerball has become society's main outlet for violence. One of the sport's biggest stars begins to challenge the system built around him. So instead of going over the plot again, let me tell you a little about how the film was made. The sport itself was only vaguely described in William Harrison's original short story, so director Norman Jewison and production designer John Box had to create most of it from scratch. They imagined it as a blend of a roulette wheel and a pinball machine, combining elements of roller derby, hockey, football, motocross, and judo. The custom track was designed by Herbert Schurmann, who had previously designed a cycling track for the 1972 Munich Olympics. Rollerball also became the first major Hollywood production to give screen credit to its stunt performers. English wrestler Mark Rocco worked on the film and later adopted Rollerball as his ring name. The game looked so convincing that the cast, extras, and stunt performers reportedly played it between takes just for fun. After the film was released, Howard Cosell interviewed Jewison and Kahn on Wide World of Sports, showing clips and walking through the rules as if it were a real televised sport. Sports promoters even reached out afterward, asking to license the game and build real leagues around it. Apparently, they had missed the point of the film, and Jewison refused the offers. That same year, Roger Corman released Death Race 2000. I do not really accept the harsh criticism it received at the time. Roger Ebert went as far as giving it 0 stars, although his review spends almost as much time worrying about the children in the theater as discussing the film itself. But how much does that matter? They made the thing for around $300,000, and it reportedly brought in close to $14 million, depending on which source you trust. For comparison, Rollerball cost about $6 million and made around $30 million. The film also gives us a pre-Rocky Sylvester Stallone and an entire race built around scoring points by running over pedestrians. Everything about it is proudly absurd. Mary Warrenoff drives a car with bullhorns attached to the front and chases a man waving a red flag across a field. At one point, nurses line up patients in wheelchairs directly in the racer's path. The gore is so exaggerated that it becomes funny in a very stupid way. Director Paul Bartel later claimed that Roger Corman added much of it after filming was finished. But beneath all the absurdity, the film also works well as a satire of its dystopian world and the media's appetite for sensationalism. It is still a great watch. I am not letting you go without one more Roger Corman production. Following his usual strategy, Corman replaced the cars with motorcycles, brought David Carradine back, and made Deathsport in 1978, unintentionally getting ahead of the Road Warrior in the process. The film takes place after the Neutron Wars, with the surviving city-states fighting one another. One of them has replaced the death penalty with a gladiatorial event called Deathsport. Criminals are forced to compete, and anyone who survives is promised freedom. Carradine is forced into the game and eventually gets his hands on a death machine, basically a motorcycle fitted with a laser. Speaking of Carradine, he later regretted taking the role. "I didn't need to do a bad picture at the time because I was on a good roll," he said. "I don't think my career ever quite recovered from that." As you have probably guessed, Deathsport did not become another huge hit, but it does have all the insanity you would expect from a grindhouse production, along with Claudia Jennings, who gets to take off her clothes twice. The Running Man is probably the most famous title in this video. While preparing it, I also watched the 2025 version. And not that this came as a surprise, but yes, the 1987 film remains the only one really worth your attention. Directed by Paul Michael Glaser, the main story takes place around 2019. Arnold Schwarzenegger plays Ben Richards, a wrongly convicted man forced to compete on the country's most popular television show. He and the other runners are sent into a huge game zone where they must survive attacks from heavily armed stalkers with ridiculous names and flashy costumes. This is technically a Stephen King adaptation, something people often seem to forget. The original novel was published under his Richard Bachman name, but the extreme violence and jokey dialogue leave little room for the book's more serious ideas. In the end, this is much more dumb fun than meaningful dystopian science fiction. But dumb fun with Arnold Schwarzenegger is its own special category, and The Running Man is one of his best. There are two ways to sell Arena. The normal way is to call it a sci-fi action movie from 1989. The better way is to say, it is basically Rocky, but with space monsters. The film takes place on a space station, where Steve Armstrong works as a diner cook alongside a four-armed alien named Shorty. Steve is good with his fists, but not exactly good at staying out of trouble. After Shorty gets into an argument with an aggressive customer, Steve steps in, and they both lose their jobs. Shorty feels indebted to Steve and decides to help him get back to Earth. But his attempt to raise the money ends with him stealing from a crime lord named Rogor and getting caught. To free him, Steve accepts an offer to fight in the arena, where competitors from different species meet in a futuristic combat sport. Arena is goofy and juvenile, but it is also pretty charming. There are side plots with romance, shady fight managers, and Shorty's little schemes, but the movie knows what we are really here for: the fights with ridiculous rubber-suited creatures. The Blood of Heroes, also known as the Salute of the Jugger, inspired a real sport called Jugger. Versions of the game developed independently in several places, including Germany and Australia, which says something about how convincing the film's central idea was. The story takes place in a barren world left behind by the wars of the 20th century. Its main form of entertainment is a brutal sport played by traveling teams known as jugs. They move from settlement to settlement, challenging local players and taking dog skulls as trophies when they win. Rutger Hauer plays Sallow, the leader of one of these teams. Their goal eventually becomes earning a chance to challenge the league, whose players live in luxury. But reaching that level means entering a much harsher version of the game. The film was written and directed by David Webb Peoples, one of the writers of Blade Runner, whose script for Unforgiven would finally reach the screen 3 years later. There are ideas about the class divide between the traveling players and the league, but the game itself remains the main attraction. Directed by Reanimator's Stuart Gordon, Robot Jox may sound like a cheap RoboCop imitation from the title alone, but the film has its own very specific idea. 50 years after a nuclear holocaust, warfare has been outlawed. Territorial disputes are now settled through one-on-one battles between giant robots, piloted by national champions known as Robot Jox. Gary Graham plays Achilles, the champion of a Western power called the Market. Its main rival is the Confederation, and since the film was made during the final years of the Cold War, the two sides are not exactly difficult to identify as stand-ins for the United States and the Soviet Union. The allegory is obvious, but Robot Jox never lets it get in the way of the machines beating each other apart. The idea was inspired by Transformers toys, Macross, and other giant robot anime. The battle scenes were created largely through stop-motion animation and miniature effects, giving the machines their chunky, old-school look. And it is hard not to see Robot Jox as an early step toward Pacific Rim, right down to the pilots locking fists before entering their machines.